This lesson is create a web API server using Node.js. In this lesson, we're going to create a web API server using Node.js, and we'll create endpoints for get, post, put, and delete. Now, just in case you're not familiar with Node.js, it's a cross-platform and open source web server that runs on Windows, Linux, Unix, macOS, and many other operating systems. It's a JavaScript runtime environment. It uses Google's V8 JavaScript engine. So this means you get to write all your services in JavaScript, which is a good thing because we're using JavaScript for our Fetch API on the client side as well. And you can download Node.js at https://nodejs.org. Now, to host my web services, I'm going to be using the Express framework. Node.js can sometimes take too many lines of code for what should be a simple task. So Express is just this package that makes these tasks simpler. It adds things like middleware, routing, templating, things like that. We can still use all the features of Node.js, but we can also then create websites and web APIs using Express very simply and easily. You can download and even get the documentation at expressjs.com, but you'll probably just bring it in as a package. So let's take a look at creating a Node web server. Now, I'm on a Windows machine here, so I'm going to go ahead and go to where I usually keep my samples for teaching, and that's under my D drive samples. And I'm going to create a new folder that I'm going to simply call Web API. And I'll go ahead and navigate down into that. And then from here, what I could do is I could open a PowerShell window or some sort of command prompt, a terminal, and I can actually do a code dot and bring up code, or I could even do an npm init right in here. And when I do that, it's going to ask me for a package name and a version and a description. I could also do npm init -y. Any of those work. I'm just going to go ahead and say, great, I've now created my, as you can see here, this package.json file. So from here, I can now open my code editor, but again, feel free to use any editor you wish. Now, what I need to do is I need to bring up a terminal because I need to add Express and NodeMon into this project. So I'm going to type in npm install. I'm going to use Express and Node Monitor, and I'll save that into the package. I'm also going to install CORS. So I need CORS, a cross-origin resource sharing, because we're going to actually create another website that is going to make the calls from Fetch. Now that I've done all of this, you can see that under this folder, I have the Node modules, my package-lock.json, and my package.json. If we go into the package.json, you can see the scripts, you see the dependencies there, CORS, Express, and NodeMon. Next, we're going to add a JSON file to supply our data that we're going to use to get back from the Fetch API. So back in this folder, I'm going to create a new folder called Assets. And within that folder, I'm going to add a new file called people.json. And inside of here, I'm going to add an array, a JSON array of person objects. You can see each object has a person ID, a first name, a last name, an email address, and a start date. So you can see I've got about 19 people in here. So that's what we're going to use as our data that we're going to use to fetch. Next, I'm going to create a repository object to read that JSON file. I'm going to right mouse click and add another new folder called repos. And inside of here, I'm going to create a new file. It'll be called the people repo.js. And I'm going to add some JavaScript in here. So what I'm going to do in this one is I'm going to let fs equal require fs. I'm bringing in the file system objects. I've got a constant that's pointing to my people.json over in that assets folder. I'm then creating an object here, let people repo equals, and I've got a get, and that's a function that's going to pass in a couple of callback, a reject and a resolve, and I'm going to attempt to read the file. And if I get an error, I'll reject. If I get the data, I will resolve it by doing a json.parse of the data that gets read in. I have a get by ID, I have an insert, I have an update, and I have a delete, all functions within this object. I'm going to export this object so that I can use it then in the rest of my application. Now, I'm not going to go into each one of these because we're not here to learn about Node.js and reading files and all of that. We're here to learn about the Fetch API. Now that we have data and we have a repository object that we can use to read and write that data, let's create our CRUD Web API endpoints that we will make calls to from our Fetch API. Let's now add a new file in the root here called index.js. And it's into here that we're going to add a bunch of code. The first one being the express. We're going to bring in express. We'll create an app by calling the express constructor. We're going to go ahead and let people repo equal require our repos, people repo.js. And we're going to bring in cores as well. We create an express router object. We do an app.use on that express.json. We're going to enable cores for all requests. Now, when I create my web server, I'm going to be using localhost 3000. So I have put that in there as a approved origin. And I'm allowing all methods, get, head, put, patch, post, and delete. I then create my list of endpoints. So I have a router.get/people. It's responsible for calling that people repo and doing a get. And if everything works okay, I'm going to get back the data. Otherwise, I'll pass the error to the built-in express error handler. Now, I did want to point out what I'm returning from the response.status200.json. So I'm sending a JSON object, and that object is always going to have a status property, a status text property, a message, and data. The status will always be consistent with what I'm returning from the response. The status text will be like okay or maybe not found. The message is anything that I want to put in, and that way I could use that from wherever I'm calling this API. And the data then is the payload, right? It's the array of JSON objects. It's the single JSON object that I'm returning, a people, a customer, a employee, whatever I'm returning. But it's important to always have a consistent object that goes back so the users or the consumers of your web API know what to expect. So when I'm calling this from the Fetch API, I know I'm always going to get back this object. I have a router.get people/:ID. This is where we can pass an ID and we get a single person. I have a router.post. And into this, I will then call the people repo.insert, passing in that request.body. I have a router.put, where I'm going to call the get by ID, and if everything works there, then I will attempt to update the data by doing a people repo.update. And I also have a router.delete here that will attempt to get the ID. If it finds it, it will attempt to delete that data. Now, obviously, we would never do this on a production app because you'd have multiple users coming in. Since we're doing just a test of the Fetch API, I'm the only one running this. I'm not worried about reading and writing to that people.json file because I'm the only one doing this. Normally, you would use a database, but I wanted to have something very simple to show you so that we can at least have some full CRUD capabilities. The last things we do down here is we do an app.use and say for that router, I want to put a /API prefix in front of all of those. And then I let server equals app.listen on 5000. So I'm listening on port 5000. And it's just going to display a little console.log here that says that our node server is running on that localhost 5000. Now, if we were to save everything, so that we know everything has been saved, we should now be able to do an npm start. But actually, I need to add one thing because I really want to use node monitoring, because what that does, it says if anything changes, what's great about this is that node monitor will see if I change that index.js file, it will automatically reload the web server for me. So I'm adding this here in the scripts. Then I'm allowed down here in the terminal window to do an npm start. And we should see that node server is now running on that localhost 5000. If we were then bring up browser or Postman. Let's go ahead and do that. And here we are now in Postman. And you can see I've put in my HTTP localhost :5000 API/people. And if I now send that, we should get the data over here. Let's go ahead and click on this pretty here. And we see that we had a status of 200, status text of OK, a message all people retrieved. So that comes from that response object. And then we have the data property. That is my JSON array of all of the data that I read in. So in this lesson, we learned about Node.js and Express. We created that web API server from those two items. And then we created a JSON file for some data. We created a repository object to allow us to read and write that file, and created our CRUD set of web API endpoints. I had to have a web server to allow you to call something, right, using the fetch API. So I wanted to at least present how I created it so you could do it as well, but that's not the point of this course. It's really about the next modules in this course. Coming up next, use the fetch API to get data.